Hey Groves, what's up? Hope you're doing well in your Grove tonight. My name is Blaine Tiller. I'm our worship pastor here at Rising Church, and I hope you guys are just getting excited about this week's study in Psalms. It's hard to believe that we're a little over halfway through our study through the book of Psalms already. And just as a reminder, I loved what Aaron said at the outset of the Psalms. As we're working through these, as we're discussing them, as we are just processing these chapters as a group in our groves, these three questions of adore, admit, and aspire. This idea of adore, God, what are you showing me about yourself in these Psalms? What can I learn about who you are and what your character is so that I can praise you and worship you more? This second question of admit, what am I learning about myself? What am I learning about the world around me? The fallenness of this world in contrast from your beauty and your perfection, your power and your love, God. And lastly, this question of aspire. What do you want me to do, God? How would you have me live and act according to what I'm learning about you, what I'm learning about myself, what I'm learning about the world, so that I can bring you glory and honor? And so I'm hoping that these questions are still continuing to guide you along as you study. A question that we had in last week's discussion read this: what do you think about Psalm 71:18? Even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, my God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come. And the question attached to that was this: why does it seem like in modern church culture, the older generation has lost sight of this passage, that the older generation has lost their passion for the next generation? Why do we withdraw as the older generation? Now, this was an interesting question for my Grove. The Grove that I get to be a part of is a bunch of college-aged young adults, somewhere in between 18 and 25 years old. And so this was an interesting question for us because we're not quite that older generation yet. In many ways, we still are coming up into this idea of being the current generation. So this was an interesting question. So I kind of flipped it around a little bit. I changed this question, and instead I asked our group, as the now generation that will one day become this older generation, looking down on younger generations, what is it that we must do now to make sure that we don't become the kind of generation that we read like here, the one that loses their passion for the next generation, one that loses sight of this passage in Psalm 71? And so we threw on this idea that, and it was really cool that even as young people in between the ages of 18 and 25, along in our 20s, what are we doing right now? What foundations are we laying right now so that we make sure that all of our lives, from now until we are the older generation, is living to invest and pour into this next generation, to tell of what God has done, to tell of his beautiful works, right? It reminds me of something that we read of in this week's study in Psalm chapter 78. And so what I'm going to do is read through verses 2 through 8 of Psalm chapter 78. It says this: I will declare wise sayings. I will speak mysteries from the past, things we have heard and known, and that our ancestors have passed down to us. We will not hide them from their children, but will tell a future generation the praiseworthy acts of the Lord, his might, and the wondrous works he has performed. He established a testimony in Jacob and set up a law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach to their children, so that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. They were to rise and tell their children, so that they might put their confidence in God and not forget God's works, but keep his commands. Check this out. Then, in verse 8, then they would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not loyal and whose spirit was not faithful to God. And so at the end of this passage, we see kind of the result of what it looks like when we don't make it a priority to pass down the things of God, the ways of God, to the next generation, right? They become like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not loyal and whose spirit was not faithful to God. And the question that I kind of want us to poke around for a little bit tonight is, why do we become this way? What is it about living this world? What is it about this walk with Jesus that is so difficult? What is the reason that many Christians, many believers into their old age lose this passion? They lose sight of what it means to invest in the next generation, to pass on the things of God. I think I might have an idea that I want to introduce us to tonight, or maybe just kick around a little bit. A couple chapters earlier in our reading, it was actually the first chapter that we read this week, chapter 73, talks about this inner conflict, kind of almost this like character arc that the author of this psalm experiences, this tension in between faithfully and humbly submitting to the Lord and not envying, not being jealous of the arrogant or the wicked, the people that have turned their back on God. I want to read from a couple spots in this chapter, not the whole thing, but a couple spots. In verse 2, the author says this, "But as for me, my feet almost slipped. My steps nearly went astray. For I envied the arrogant. I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have an easy time until they die, and their bodies are well fed. They are not in trouble like others. They are not afflicted like most people." And so for those of us that have chosen to put our faith and trust in Jesus, who have chosen to humble ourselves and trust God's way and not the world's way, oftentimes when we look at the arrogant, when we look at the proud in our world, the people that have said, no, I can do this on my own, I don't need God, we often see very comfortable lives, right? Like it's easy to look at these people and say, man, like, it seems like all this burden, all this stuff that I seem to have to carry in my world because I'm submitting to God's way and not my way, they don't have to deal with that, right? It just seems so convenient, seems so easy, right? Verse 9, they set their mouths against heaven and their tongues strut across the earth. Therefore, his people turn to them and drink their overflowing words. The wicked, the arrogant say, how can God know? Does the Most High know everything? Does he know anything at all? And so we see that in the midst of what seems like a convenient, what seems like an easy and burdenless life, the people of God are tempted to turn towards this and say, well, that looks like a lot more convenient. That looks like the path of least resistance in our world today. So they begin to drink their overflowing words. And for those of us who have this life, who have this heart of wanting to stay dedicated, wanting to stay humbled under the mighty hand of God, it can start to feel like, is all of this really worth it? Is this life of humble faithfulness, this life of obedience to God, is it really worth it? Even the author struggles with this in verse 13. Did I purify my heart and wash my hands in innocence for nothing? For I am afflicted all day long and punished every morning. Now, I wonder if part of this is when we open our eyes, when we see the truth, when we see God's way, we can't help but be broken by the things that are broken in this world. When we know better, we are held accountable to what is better. And so our lives sometimes can seem like there's a cost, there's a sacrifice to this, right? This whole idea of ignorance is bliss. If I didn't know the ways of the Lord, then everything could be bliss. I think that's kind of what the author is getting to here. And this is the struggle that we face. Until what we read in verse 17, the author says this, until I entered God's sanctuary, I entered into his presence. I choose to see with his eyes. Until I entered God's sanctuary, then I understood their destiny, the wicked, the arrogant. Indeed, you put them in slippery places. You make them fall into ruin. How suddenly they become a desolation. They become a desolation. They come to an end, swept away by terrors. And it's like the veil is finally lifted from the author's eyes to see this life that seems like it is easy, convenient, abundant, wealthy, prosperous, is really just an illusion. That in a moment, the arrogance ways, they're washed away, right? How suddenly they become a desolation. Everything seems good on the outside. Everything seems like this is the right, this is the easy, this is convenient life to live until it all comes toppling down. And what we see is this beautiful resolution in the heart and the mind of the author. In verse 25, when it says this, who do I have in heaven but you? And I desire nothing on earth but you. My flesh and my heart may fail, talking about this inward struggle. But God is the strength of my heart, my portion forever. And this beautiful, too long, didn't read at the end of the chapter in verse 27, 28 says this, those far from you will certainly perish. You destroy all who are unfaithful to you. But as for me, God's presence is my good. I love that idea, that simple statement. God's presence alone is my good. I have made the Lord God my refuge, so I can tell about all you do. And so the question that I want us to be asking as we come out of this is, how do we avoid being another generation, right? Being another generation like this that forgets the things of God, that forgets to pass on the things of God, the way of Jesus to this next generation. It's by realizing this, that as for me, God's presence is my good. Even though it might not look like it, even though I might see this illusion of success and ease and convenience in the way of the world, that at the end of the day, my good is in God's presence. This confession, this recognition that my flesh and heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart, my portion forever. These are just some ideas that I'd love for us to just be thinking about as we get into our discussion tonight. What does this look like? What does it look like for us to make God our portion? So I hope you guys have an awesome night of discussion, and I've just loved being in this Psalms study together. And like I said, we're a little bit over halfway through. So now that we're at this halfway point, let's commit to finishing strong, to staying committed, staying disciplined. And I think we're going to reap amazing things out of this. Wisdom that as we make God our portion, that he will reveal himself to us in beautiful and mighty ways. Peace out, Groves. See you later.